Welcome back to the last week of our study of the Book of Esther. This week we'll be finishing up a study that's taken us several weeks so far, 5 in total, and I think it's been a good study. The Book of Esther is one that doesn't mention the word God. It's not as outwardly religious in the way that other ones are, and there's some implications for that that we'll talk about today. So they're in captivity, the people in the book, and so there's no temple, there's no festivals that they need to go and worship and things like that. We don't see accounts of prayer to God for salvation and all of that. We really see a dry season for the characters in the story, for the Jews that find themselves in Persia at the moment. And so the question is God there? Where do we see God? Where do we find God? And they need him the most because there's a plot to be annihilated. And so we've talked about those things. How a lot of times in many seasons of our life, Jesus is not the one out there doing the miracles like we see in the Bible, but rather working behind the scenes. And so we see the timing of God, we see the blessing of God, we see the fact that God remembers his people even in captivity. And so the overarching theme of that is still there. And we have one final lesson for today, and we'll be looking at passages of Scripture in the Book of Esther, chapters 8, 9, and 10. We'll just read a few verses from each one. I want to start by rereading some of the passages from last week. We ended up in chapter 8, reading these words, chapter 8, verses 3 through 8. Esther spoke again to the king. This is after Haman was annihilated, hung on his own gallows. And so he's not a threat really anymore to the Jewish people. But if you'll remember from last week, the edict that went out that Haman wrote in the name of the king with his signet ring, it still stands. And so there's still some drama that needs to be resolved. And so Esther's going to ask the king to take back his edict. And here we see the answer. So she fell at his feet when Esther spoke again to the king and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, that means that Esther was allowed to see the king. Esther rose and stood before him and said, "If it please the king, if I have found favor in his sight, if the thing seems right before the king and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in the provinces of the king. How can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" And King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, who was now rising up within the kingdom, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So Esther says, let's revoke the edict that you wrote. And the king wisely says that can't be revoked. It's written with the king's name and with the signet ring. What you can do is write another edict sharing something that might save the Jews, but you can't revoke, you can't undo what's already been written. And what had already been written was on a particular day of the year, the people could go and kill, destroy, and annihilate all the Jews. And so what would they do? What could they write that would allow them to protect themselves against these attackers and marauders who are coming on that particular day of the year? And so Mordecai and Esther, with the king's hand, with his in his name, and with his signet ring that now Mordecai has instead of Haman, they have to write an edict. And this is what they wrote. Verse 11 of that chapter, this is what it says, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. So the idea is that the edict of Haman went out that said on this particular day you can kill all the Jews, annihilate, destroy women, men, children, and plunder everything that they have. Now, all the people who hate the Jews, who have also been taken into captivity, and perhaps some of the Persians too, probably making plans to attack the Jews on this day. The second edict went out, and basically the second edict says this: the Jews can defend themselves. If you attack them, if you have an armed force ready to annihilate them, they can annihilate you. And if they do annihilate you, whoever annihilates whoever can take the plunder. And so essentially it's a reversal of the original without being a reversal of the original, just as the king, that the Jews can defend themselves. And there's an interesting verse right there at the end of the chapter that says this: because the fear of the Jews had fallen on many, many of the people in the country decided to declare themselves Jewish. So the Jews are finally allowed within the Persian Empire to defend themselves. And a lot of people in that area are like, oh, I happen to be a Jew. Oh, so am I. Oh, we're all Jews, because they didn't want Mordecai, who's now second in command, to write things in order that they would feel threatened themselves. And so what is it? It's everybody jumping on the bandwagon. That's what it is. It's this group is popular. Oh, I love them. Whichever team happens to have won the championship is my team. I go buy a hat even though I never watched them before. All of a sudden I'm a fan of the biggest team out there. And so that's human nature. That happens from time to time. What happens? How do we see victory here? What we see is that these things are recorded in verse 20 of chapter 9. Mordecai records all these things, sends the letters out through all the provinces, the same provinces that they were sent before. And basically they said that on the 14th and the 15th day, they were able to get relief from their enemies. The month had been turned for them. From sorrow into gladness, from mourning into a holiday. They see, if you go back and reread chapter 9, that 500 people who attacked the Jews in the capital city of Susa were killed. And then if you look at the entire region, the entire Persian Empire, the number that's listed in the Book of Esther, somewhere around 75,000 people. So 75,000 people decide to attack the Jews, and the Jews win. And so they have actually killed, not going out to annihilate any particular person, but only defending themselves. And the other interesting thing is that they decide not to take plunder. It says time and time again that they didn't take the plunder of those that they killed. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So what they do is they decide that on this particular day, and there's a description of, in the main area, extending that one day to take care of the family of Haman, who obviously dislikes them because their dad was hung on his own gallows. Whether they celebrate on the 14th or the 15th, and the idea is in the capital city, there was another day of work to try to protect themselves, and they rested on the 15th. The rest of the country was the 14th. And so those two particular days are a day of celebration. They're a day of feasting, a day of celebrating, a day of boisterousness. To be loud and obnoxious and celebrate and happy. Obnoxious probably has negative connotations, but you know what I mean. Go out and celebrate and be happy. And feast, and what you would do is, this is the beginning of the feast in the Jewish tradition of Purim. And so this is the description of why it's called Purim. If you remember at the beginning of the chapter, when they're casting lots to determine which day it is that the Jews will be attacked, or which day it is that Haman will go before Ahasuerus to ask that this plot be put in motion, they cast basically a die, or a pur, P-U-R, and that's the way they decide when all this stuff is going to go down. And so basically he's casting, in Hebrew it was casting a lot. A lot of the English version would just call it casting lots. And so the feast is called Purim, lots. And so the idea is a lot of this was set up on chance. And so the Jews, after this, and you can go back and read some of this, verse 26, they called the days Purim, after the term Pur. Therefore, because all that is written in this letter and of what they had faced in this matter, of what happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring, all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days, 14th, 15th, according to what was written at the time appointed every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept through every generation, every clan, every province, every city, that these days of Purim would never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should their commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So the Jews celebrate the fact that people are trying to annihilate them. This is not the only time in the history of the Jewish people where they were, somebody made an attempt to try to annihilate the entire race. It's happened again since then. It's happened several times. There was a vast hatred that we talked about of the Jews going back, and it's a matter of history, the hatred against the Jews. And so they just celebrated, hey, this is when we survived. And so the Jewish faith today, as I understand it, not being one who follows the Jewish faith today, but being a Christian and having read, the Jews today will celebrate by going to the synagogue and reading the entire book of Esther. Because of the happiness of the event, the boisterousness of the event, what you'll see happen is, from what I've read, that people will bring even noisemakers, and that people will hoo and ha like they're at a ball game. Every time the name of Haman, they might, bad. And every time somebody good, the hero Esther, Mordecai, they'll celebrate and yell and woo and bring in noisemakers. They'll dress up. They'll have an effigy of Haman that they might burn at some point during the event. They'll have a big feast, and they commemorate it by taking up offerings, giving to the poor, and giving gifts to each other. Many of those gifts have to do with food and celebration, fine foods and celebration that they would give to each other, and then taking care of the poor. Why would they include taking care of the poor? Well, because at one time they were poor. They had nothing. They were in a place where they had no power, no money, no ability to influence, and yet they survived. And so the Feast of Purim today, what makes it interesting, it's not particularly a religious feast. They're not prayers necessarily. There are kids' songs, but they're not descriptions of God, because the Book of Esther is seen more or less as a secular book within the Bible. It doesn't mention God. So where is God in this place? Well, go back to the idea of plunder for a minute. Why did the Jews not take plunder from those around them when they beat them? Again, mostly the Amalekites were responsible through Haman. Why did they not take the plunder of the 10 sons? If you'll go back to the book of Samuel, when the Israelites and the Amalekites are fighting, when Saul is king, you'll see that God says, you're not supposed to take anything. Everything is supposed to be destroyed. And so the Jews, the Israelites at the time, would not have taken any plunder from the Amalekites because of that description. The history of the Amalekites went back to when the children of Israel were leaving Egypt. The Amalekites opposed them, and for that reason, God opposed the Amalekites. And so when it came down to the Israelites defeating the Amalekites, God said, don't take anything from them. They opposed me and destroy everything. And so the Israelites, that was the deal at the time. Now, of course, Saul sinned in that regard. We talked about that some earlier, and it was Samuel who eventually fulfilled what God had told him to do. But so why Israelites these a number of years later, when they're in captivity, why would they not take plunder? Well, maybe it was obedience to God. Maybe it was a recognition of God in that moment. Why the fasting of Esther? Why 3 days? So I think God is all in this passage, and even though it's not out in the open for everybody to see, I think it's still extraordinarily obvious that Esther is a book about God remembering His people. That Esther is a book about God providing for His people and protecting His people. In the timing, in the background, in the behind the scenes, today we might say, where's God in the midst of our situation? Do we see miracles happening? Do we see all of these things where God is obviously taking a part in history? Maybe we don't, but maybe we do need to see God still working behind the scenes. The timing of things working out. And some of those things we may not see till later. One of the biggest parts of the book, I think, is if God remembers us and takes care of us, do we remember Him? And so turning the conversation a little bit to what are the ways in which we remember Him? If we say, this is where God has brought us to this point, how do we teach your children about those points? There's plenty in the Bible about God saying to the Israelite people, take a group of stones and put it here so that when your kids ask, you'll know. Transitioning our beliefs and our Thanksgiving and our feasts and our festivals and all the things that we remember about God to the next generation, incorporating those traditions into our life so that we have those opportunities to tell the children. Well, in our celebration of Easter, perhaps, is one of them. Every year we celebrate Easter. Every year we tell the story of Jesus dying on the cross, being buried, but then being resurrected on the third day. Perhaps Christmas, the greatest story of the gift of love being born into a lowly manger, the King of Kings descending into a planet to save us from our sins. What are the other things that we celebrate? The Lord's Supper, perhaps, our remembering what Jesus did on the cross and the Last Supper with his disciples. What are other things that we remember? A baptism, something, but it's something in our lives that we put up for the sake of causing us to remember what it is that God has done in our life. And not only that we remember that, but in remembering we tell the story to the next generation. We make those traditions a part of who we are and about what we teach our children so that they might also know who God is and what he's done. Because the opposite of that is not remembering what God has done. There's a story, not a story, but a saying, those who don't know their history are bound to repeat it. And not knowing our history, not knowing where we came from, in many ways is unacceptable and leads to chaos and leads to people tearing down good things because they don't know why they're there. And so we need to tell those stories, but it is the story of God remembering us. Our remembering God is a story, what we remember is a story of God remembering us. And so I hope you've enjoyed the Book of Esther. I have too. Enjoyed diving into it. And even though sometimes we have to jump back into history to understand the way things were and all the symbolism of that, I think it's a worthy thing to do. And so even though it's slightly more historical than some of the other things we've studied, and less theological in many ways, since God's not there, I think the lesson for our lives is still a great lesson. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Check back in, and we'll be beginning our next study soon. God bless you.